A quiet black student investigated a strange metallic rattling in her high school's condemned wing. What she found chained in the dark was a Korean Mafia boss, and saving him would ensure she never graduated. The rattling started at 9:15 p.m., just as Asha Thorne was closing her calculus textbook in the hallway of the West Wing. She knew this section of St. Jude's Academy like the back of her hand. She'd been hiding here for 4 years, ever since she realized the construction zone was the only place on campus where she could truly be invisible. The derelict boys' locker room loomed on her left. All caution tape and dust sheets. A rotting skeleton of the school's architecture that the wealthy administration had paid to ignore. But you couldn't ignore that sound. Even muffled, even through the heavy oak doors, the rhythmic clank cut through the rainy night silence like a warning bell. Asha froze, her worn sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. She pulled out one earbud, the lo-fi steady beat dying as she strained to hear. Nothing. Just the distant hum of the vending machine down the hall. Maybe she'd imagined it. Maybe her mind was playing tricks after skipping dinner and 6 hours of staring at equations. She started packing her bag, faster now. She couldn't afford to be caught here. Dean Miller had already warned her about unauthorized loitering twice this semester. Once for sleeping in the library. Once for staying late in the computer lab. One more strike and her scholarship was gone. And graduation was in exactly 21 days. The thought made her stomach clench. A full-ride university offer sat in her inbox. Losing this scholarship meant losing that future. That left her with zero money, zero family support, and a one-way ticket back to a group home she had fought for years to escape. She told herself to keep moving. She told herself that her future was worth more than a noise in the dark. But then the sound came again, a low, ragged groan that no pipe or radiator could ever make. She was standing on the edge of a cliff, and she was about to jump. Hit that subscribe button to see if she survives the fall, because Asha is about to open the door. Asha's hand trembled as it touched the cold brass handle. The groan had stopped, replaced by a wet, ragged breathing that sounded too loud in the dead silence. She pushed the door open. It swung inward with a heavy creak that echoed like a gunshot, announcing her presence to whatever waited in the dark. She expected the smell of mildew, old sweat, or the damp earth of the construction site. Instead, the air was thick with something sharper. Copper. Salt. It was the scent of a nosebleed that wouldn't stop, amplified 100 times until it coated the back of her throat. She pulled her cardigan tighter around herself, stepping over a roll of caution tape that had fallen to the floor. The locker room was a cavern of shadows, lit only by the faint orange wash of streetlights filtering through the high, grimy windows. Rows of navy blue lockers stood like silent sentinels, covered in a fine layer of white drywall dust. Asha moved past them, counting the numbers in her head to ground herself. 112. 114. Her sneakers left tracks in the dust, marking a path she instinctively knew she shouldn't be taking. She rounded the corner of the final row, and the breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a janitor. It wasn't a stray animal. A man was slumped against the structural concrete pillar in the center of the room. He looked like he had been dropped from a nightmare into her reality. He wore a suit that must have cost more than her entire tuition, now shredded and dark with soak-through stains. His head hung low, black hair matting against his forehead, but it was the chains that made Asha's knees weak. Heavy, industrial-grade steel wrapped tight around his torso and wrists, bolting him to the pillar as if he were a rabid animal. Asha took a step back, her heel skidding. The sound made the man's head snap up. Even in the gloom, the motion was sharp, predatory. A dragon tattoo curled up the side of his neck, the ink disappearing into his hairline, pulsing with the tension of his jaw. But what froze Asha wasn't the tattoo, or the bruising that swelled his left eye shut. It was the sound. Drip. Drip. She looked down. The floor tiles here were white, checkered with the school's crest in blue, a symbol of order, prestige, and safety. But right now, a steady stream of crimson was dripping from the man's fingertips, pooling on the dusty crest. The bright, violent red against the sterile school tile broke something in Asha's mind. Violence belonged on the news, or in the streets she avoided on her way home. It didn't belong here, where she took exams and worried about GPAs. The sanctuary of St. Jude's had been breached, and looking at the blood pooling near her sneaker, Asha realized she was standing in a grave. The silence stretched so thin it felt like it would snap. His eyes didn't blink. They were dark, abyssal, and completely devoid of the fear that was currently radiating off her own skin. He didn't look at her like a victim hoping for rescue, he looked at her like she was an error in a calculation, a variable that needed to be removed. A raspy sound tore from his throat, followed by a wet cough that sprayed a fine mist of red onto his ruined shirt. He spoke, but the words were sharp, guttural syllables she didn't understand. Korean. The tone was low and venomous, sounding less like communication and more like a curse directed at the universe. I heard a noise, Asha whispered, the words feeling stupid and small in the face of such raw violence. She took a step back, her heel hitting a metal bench with a clang. The man's eyes narrowed. He shifted, testing the tension of the steel links. The chains rattled ominously, a heavy, unforgiving sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Even immobilized, even broken and bleeding, he didn't look helpless. He looked like a tiger caught in a snare, injured, yes, but lethal to anyone foolish enough to get within striking distance. The darkness of the unlit hallway had been frightening because of what Asha imagined might be hiding in it. But this man was real, and the danger radiating off him was colder and more absolute than any shadow. He seemed to realize she didn't understand him. He swallowed hard, his throat working against the pain, and focused his gaze on the crest of her school blazer. A flicker of recognition passed through his good eye, followed immediately by a hardening of his expression. School, he rasped, the English broken, thick with blood and exhaustion. He spat to the side, clearing his mouth. Not them. Asha's hand was still gripping the strap of her backpack so hard her knuckles were white. I can call for help, she stammered, her voice trembling. I have a phone. I can call 911. No. The word exploded from him, sudden and violent. He leaned forward as far as the chains would allow, the metal biting into his wrists until fresh blood welled up around the steel cuffs. The sheer intensity of his presence hit her like a physical blow, pushing her back toward the door. No police. No phone. He stared at her, and for a second, Asha forgot to breathe. It wasn't the stare of a dying man. It was the command of a king sitting on a throne of ash. Run, he growled, the single syllable vibrating with a terrifying authority. If they find you, you die. His eyes bored into hers, promising a violence she couldn't comprehend. Get out. Now. Asha stumbled backward, the sheer force of his command acting like a physical shove. She didn't need to be told twice. Every survival instinct she had honed growing up in a system that chewed people up was screaming at her to flee. She turned, her sneakers skidding on the dust, and reached for the heavy double doors. Crash. The sound of shattering glass tore through the hallway outside, echoing off the metal lockers like a scream. It was followed immediately by the crunch of heavy boots on broken shards and the wet thud of a door being kicked open. Asha froze, her hand hovering inches from the push bar. The noise came from the West Wing entrance, the only way out. Voices drifted in. Low. Male. Speaking rapid, sharp Korean. They weren't whispering, they didn't think anyone was here to hear them. They sounded casual, efficient, like men clocking in for a shift at a slaughterhouse. Panic clawed at her throat, hot and suffocating, but she swallowed it down. If she opened the door now, she'd walk straight into the barrel of a gun. She spun around, scanning the small vestibule between the locker room and the main hall. To her right, a narrow door marked custodial sat slightly ajar. She lunged for it, slipping inside and pulling it shut just as the main locker room door swung open with a violent bang. The closet was a vertical coffin, barely a broom width across. It smelled of chemical lemon bleach and sour, old mop water, a sharp contrast to the metallic tang of blood outside. Asha pressed her back against metal shelves stacked with industrial paper towels, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She clamped both hands over her mouth, terrified that the sound of her own pulse would give her away. The closet door had louvered vents on the bottom half. Through the rusted metal slats, she could see the locker room floor. Beams of blinding white light sliced through the darkness. The flashlight swept over the tiles, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the disturbed air before settling on the floor. 2 pairs of black combat boots walked into her narrow field of view. The men wore dark raincoats that dripped rainwater onto the dry floor, leaving a trail that mingled with the dust. Asha stopped breathing. In the hands of the man on the right, hanging loosely by his thigh, was a pistol with a long, cylindrical attachment on the barrel. A silencer. They weren't school security. They weren't police. These were the Reapers Du Hyun had warned her about, and they had returned to make sure the body was cold. The heavy boots turned, grinding broken glass into the floor. The flashlight beam sliced away from her hiding spot, sweeping back toward the exit. The men exchanged a few more sharp words, orders, likely, before marching out the double doors. The sound of their footsteps faded down the corridor, but the sense of dread remained, hanging in the air like smoke. They weren't leaving for good, they were sweeping the perimeter, checking the other exits to ensure their prey had nowhere to run. Silence rushed back into the closet, heavy and suffocating. Asha slumped against the wire shelves, her legs trembling so violently she nearly slid to the floor. She was safe. They were gone. She had a window, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 5, to slip out the back maintenance door, sprint across the muddy athletic fields, and disappear into the city. She could go back to her dorm, pull the covers over her head, and pretend she had never walked into the West Wing. She looked through the vents one last time. Du Hyun hadn't moved. His head rested against the concrete pillar, eyes closed, chest barely rising. Without the terrifying intensity of his gaze, the illusion of the monster vanished. He looked like a discarded thing, broken and waiting for the trash collection. Asha fumbled with the strap of her backpack, her fingers brushing against the plastic laminate of her lanyard. She pulled it up to her face in the gloom. St. Jude's Academy. Student ID, Asha Thorne. The photo showed a girl with a polite, hopeful smile, a girl who followed rules, kept her head down, and stayed invisible. That girl would run. That girl would survive to see graduation. But then she looked at the blood pooling on the tiles. If she walked away now, she wasn't just running, she was signing his death warrant. She would be the last person to see him alive, and she would carry the weight of his execution for the rest of her life. The silence of the locker room wasn't peaceful, it was a pause before the end. She squeezed the ID card until the sharp plastic edges bit into her palm, the pain grounding her. She couldn't be that girl. Not tonight. Asha took a breath that rattled in her chest, a ragged intake of lemon-scented air mixed with fear. Then, before her survival instinct could scream at her to stop, she shut the closet door open and stepped back into the arena. She didn't look at Du Hyun again. There wasn't time for reassurance, and she had nothing to offer him yet but empty hands. She turned on her heel and sprinted softly back into the corridor, her socks sliding on the polished floor. She knew exactly where she was going. 2 doors down from the locker room was the old maintenance supply closet, a converted shop class that the construction crew had been using as a staging ground. If there was anything in this school capable of snapping industrial steel, it would be in there. Asha pushed the door open, wincing as the hinges gave a low, dry squeal. She froze, waiting for a shout or the beam of a flashlight to cut through the darkness, but the hallway remained empty. She slipped inside and let the door click shut behind her. The room smelled of sawdust, grease, and old oil. Shadows stretched long and distorted across the workbenches, turning vices and saw blades into monstrous shapes. Asha pulled her phone from her pocket, using the dim glow of the screen to sweep the room. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she scanned the pegboards. Hammers. Screwdrivers. A rusty handsaw. Nothing that could bite through the hardened steel binding the man in the next room. She moved to the metal shelving units in the back, her breath coming in shallow, silent gasps. Her hands were shaking so bad she had to clasp them together for a second to stop the tremors. If she dropped something, if she knocked a wrench onto the concrete floor, the sound would travel straight down the hall to the men searching the perimeter. Metal on metal was a death sentence. She reached for a heavy toolbox on the middle shelf, her fingers slick with cold sweat. She lifted the lid slowly, terrified of the creak. Inside, a jumble of wrenches and pliers shifted. She sifted through them, the metal tools clinking softly, a sound that roared like thunder in her ears. She flinched, pausing, waiting for footsteps. Silence. She kept digging. Come on. Come on. Then, she saw them. Tucked on the bottom shelf, behind a stack of paint cans, was a pair of bolt cutters. They were massive, with long, red rubberized handles and jaws that looked strong enough to bite through bone. Asha crouched down and wrapped her hands around the cold steel. They were heavier than she expected, a dead weight that strained her wrists as she lifted them. She clutched the tool against her chest, feeling the solid, unforgiving reality of it. This wasn't a textbook or a pencil. It was a weapon, a key, and a burden all at once. She took a steadying breath, the scent of grease filling her lungs, and turned back toward the door. She had the means. Now she just had to use them before the Reapers came back. Asha slipped back into the locker room, the bolt cutters dragging her arms down like lead weights. The silence was heavier now, charged with the knowledge of the men prowling outside. Du-Hyun's eyes snapped open the moment she crossed the threshold. He didn't look relieved. He looked furious, his jaw tightening as he registered that she hadn't obeyed his command to run. She didn't give him a chance to speak. She dropped to her knees beside him, the hard tile biting into her skin. The space between the pillar and his body was non-existent, forcing her to invade the personal radius of a man who radiated danger like a blast furnace. To get the jaws of the cutters around the chain binding his torso, she had to lean in, practically embracing the violence she was trying to free him from. Up close, the terrifying abstraction of the Mafia boss dissolved into sensory overload. He smelled of burnt gunpowder and old blood, sharp and metallic, but beneath that was something incongruously expensive, a deep, woodsy musk of sandalwood and cologne that lingered on his torn suit. It was the scent of a world Asha had never touched, intoxicating and suffocating all at once. Heat radiated off him in waves, a feverish warmth that soaked through her thin uniform shirt. Asha fumbled with the heavy tool, her breath hitching as her arm brushed against his chest. His muscles were rock hard, coiled tight with pain and adrenaline. He didn't flinch, but his breathing stopped, his entire body going rigid as she maneuvered the steel jaws around the thickest link near his ribs. "You are a fool," he whispered, the words barely a breath against her ear. It wasn't an insult, it sounded more like a condemnation of her survival instincts. He wasn't looking at the tool. He was looking at her. His dark gaze dropped from her face to the embroidered crest on her blazer. The gold thread of the St. Jude's insignia caught the dim light, a shield, a book, and a cross. Symbols of protection, learning, and faith. Du-Hyun stared at it, his expression fracturing for a split second. He wasn't looking at a savior anymore. He was looking at a child. A student in a pleated skirt and a blazer, holding a tool meant for demolition, kneeling in the dirt to save a monster. The realization seemed to hit him harder than the beatings had, the sheer, absurd contrast of her innocence against his brutality. "Hold still," Asha murmured, her voice trembling as she adjusted her grip on the red rubber handles. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, summoning every ounce of strength in her arms. "Just, hold still." She pushed down on the handles. The metal groaned, a high-pitched protest against the pressure. She gritted her teeth, leaning her entire body weight into the leverage, her face inches from the dragon tattoo on his neck. For a moment, they were suspended in the dark, the girl trying to save a life, and the killer wondering why she hadn't let him die. With a final, teeth-gritting shove, the bolt cutters sheared through the steel link with a dull snap. The sudden release of tension sent a shockwave up Asha's arms, but the effect on Du Hyun was immediate and catastrophic. Without the chains holding him upright, gravity reclaimed him. He didn't step away from the pillar, he crumpled. He hit the tiled floor with a heavy, wet thud that made Asha flinch, his body going limp for a split second before pain shocked him back into motion. He let out a sharp hiss through clenched teeth, his hand flying immediately to his right leg. "Hey," Asha whispered urgently, dropping the cutters and scrambling to his side. "We have to move. Can you stand?" Du Hyun braced his hands against the floor, veins bulging in his neck as he tried to leverage himself up. He managed to get one foot under him, but the moment he put weight on his right leg, it buckled. He collapsed again, catching himself on one arm, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. Asha looked down. The fabric of his trousers below the knee was torn and soaked in a dark, slick stain that was spreading fast. The leg sat at a wrong, unnatural angle. It wasn't just hurt, it was shattered. "Useless," Du Hyun spat, the word laced with self-loathing. He looked up at her, his face gray with shock but his eyes burning with that same terrifying intensity. "Bone is broken. I cannot run." He shoved her shoulder with his good hand, weak but determined. "This changes nothing. Go." "I'm not leaving you," Asha said, her voice sounding steadier than she felt. She wasn't thinking about the logic of it anymore, she was operating on pure adrenaline. She grabbed his arm, thick, heavy, and hot to the touch, and hauled it over her shoulders. "On 3. You push, I pull. Girl. 1. 2. 3. She heaved upward, straining against the dead weight of him. Du Hyun groaned, a low rumble of agony, but he forced himself to move, driving upward with his good leg. They swayed dangerously for a moment, a clumsy tangle of limbs, before finding a precarious balance. The weight of him was crushing. He was a wall of solid muscle and dense bone, towering over her small frame. As he leaned into her, Asha felt her knees buckle slightly under the strain. It wasn't just the physical mass of a grown man she was supporting, it felt like the entire oppressive weight of the dark world he belonged to had just been transferred onto her spine. She was carrying his violence, his enemies, and his blood, all resting heavily against her neck. "Lean on me," she gritted out, adjusting her grip on his waist to keep him upright. Du Hyun looked down at her, his breathing ragged against her ear, disbelief warring with pain in his gaze. He didn't argue again. He just tightened his grip on her shoulder, accepting the crutch she offered, and for the first time, he let her carry him. They moved like a wounded animal, a clumsy, three-legged shuffle through the labyrinth of the West Wing. Every step was a negotiation with pain. Du Hyun gritted his teeth, his breath hissing through them in sharp, rhythmic bursts as he forced his broken leg to drag across the linoleum. Asha bore the brunt of his weight, her shoulder aching where his arm pressed down, her own legs burning from the strain. The corridor stretched out before them, an endless tunnel of shadows. To their left, the glass display cases of the trophy hall caught the faint ambient light, turning golden cups and silver plaques into ghostly mirrors. "Light," Du Hyun breathed, his grip tightening on her shoulder. Asha stopped instantly. At the far end of the hallway, a beam of white light sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the lockers. It was searching. Hunting. And it was moving toward them. The gym, Asha whispered, spotting the double doors to their right. In here. She shoved the door open with her hip, hauling Du Hyun inside just as the flashlight beam grazed the spot where they had been standing. The gymnasium was cavernous, the air smelling of floor wax and old rubber. It felt dangerously open, a vast killing field with nowhere to hide, except for the bleachers along the far wall. They were retracted, stacked like a massive wooden accordion, but there was a narrow gap at the base, a crawlspace beneath the steel undercarriage. Get down, Asha urged, helping Du Hyun lower himself. He stifled a groan that sounded like tearing fabric, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he dragged his injured leg into the darkness beneath the wooden seats. Asha scrambled in after him, pulling them deep into the shadows just as the gym doors slammed open. The beam of the flashlight cut through the room, dancing over the basketball hoops and the painted center court. Asha pressed herself into the dirt and dust bunnies, her back against the cold steel struts. Du Hyun lay beside her, his body radiating heat, his hand clamped over his own mouth to smother his labored breathing. Then came the boots. The intruders didn't stay on the floor. One of them climbed the side of the bleachers for a better vantage point. Boom. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Dust rained down on Asha's face. Boom. Boom. The footsteps thundered directly overhead, the wooden planks groaning under the weight of the killer. He was walking right on top of them. Every step vibrated through the steel frame, rattling Asha's teeth. She squeezed her eyes shut, terrified that the vibration would shake a cough loose from Du Hyun's lungs, or that a beam of light would slip through the cracks between the seats and illuminate them. They were inches from death. The killer stopped directly above Asha's head. She could hear the creak of leather, the shift of his weight. She stopped breathing, her hand instinctively finding Du Hyun's in the dark and gripping it tight. He squeezed back, his calloused palm rough against hers, a silent tether keeping them both anchored in the terrifying dark. The door to the chemistry lab clicked shut, locking out the corridor and the thunderous footsteps fading toward the library. The room was bathed in the sterile, blue-gray light of the moon filtering through the blinds, casting slatted shadows across the rows of black resin tables. It smelled of sulfur, floor wax, and the sharp tang of formaldehyde, a scent that made Asha's stomach turn, reminding her of dissections she'd tried to forget. Du Hyun didn't wait for her help this time. He shoved himself away from her, stumbling toward the nearest lab station. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as he fought to stay upright, before his strength finally gave out. He slid down the cabinetry to the floor, leaving a smear of dark blood on the pristine white cupboard doors. The kit, he rasped, tilting his head back against the wood, eyes squeezed shut. Wall. Asha was already moving. She knew where the emergency station was, next to the eyewash sink. She yanked the white metal box off the wall brackets, ignoring the authorized personnel only sticker, and knelt beside him. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the hum of the ventilation hood and the sound of Asha tearing open sterile packages. She reached for the hem of his ruined trousers. The fabric was stiff with dried blood, stuck to the wound. I have to cut it, she whispered, her voice shaking. Du Hyun cracked one eye open. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. Asha used the trauma shears from the kit to slice up the pant leg. When the fabric peeled away, she sucked in a sharp breath. The damage was horrific. A jagged laceration ran down his calf, deep enough to expose the muscle, sitting right on top of the swelling from the fracture. It was weeping dark, sluggish blood that pooled rapidly on the linoleum. Alcohol first, Du Hyun commanded, his voice tight. Then bind it. Tight. Asha grabbed the bottle of isopropyl alcohol. This is going to burn. Do it. She poured the clear liquid directly into the open wound. Du Hyun's body went rigid. His back arched off the cabinets, and his hand shot out, gripping the metal leg of the lab table with enough force to bend the steel. A sharp hiss of air escaped through his clenched teeth, the sound vibrating in his chest like a growl. But he didn't scream. He didn't beg. He simply swallowed the agony, transmuting it into a terrifying stillness. Asha's hands hovered over him, trembling. She saw a bead of sweat roll down his temple, mixing with the grime on his face. For the first time, the mask of the invulnerable crime lord slipped. He looked human. Mortal. A man who felt pain just like anyone else, but had learned to bury it deep where it couldn't be used against him. She grabbed a roll of heavy gauze and began to wrap the leg, pulling it tight to stem the flow. As she worked, her knuckles brushed against his skin, hot, feverish, and scarred. He flinched, a microscopic recoil that he couldn't suppress. Asha paused, looking up. He was watching her. His dark eyes were no longer commanding or dismissive. They were unguarded, searching her face with a mixture of confusion and something that looked dangerously like gratitude. In the quiet of the lab, surrounded by beakers and Bunsen burners, the distance between their worlds collapsed. He wasn't a monster, and she wasn't a ghost. They were just two people trying to keep his blood inside his veins. "Done," she whispered, tying off the bandage. Du-hyun released his death grip on the table leg. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. He just nodded, the movement slow and exhausted, acknowledging the debt that was growing between them with every drop of blood she saved. The silence in the lab stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator where the biological samples were kept. Du-hyun leaned his head back against the cabinet, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm as he mastered the pain. He opened his eyes, the dark irises fixing on Asha with a look that felt less like an interrogation and more like an autopsy. "Why?" The single word hung in the air, sharp as a scalpel. Asha looked up from her blood-stained hands. "Why what? Why are you still here?" His voice was a low rasp, stripped of its earlier aggression. "You saw the gun. You heard the glass break. A smart animal runs when the predator comes. You." He gestured vaguely at her, at the first aid kit, at the defiance in her posture. "You walked back into the cage." Asha wiped her hands on her skirt, leaving a faint rust-colored smear on the gray fabric. She looked at the periodic table on the wall, avoiding his gaze. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." Du-hyun frowned, confused. "You have a home." "I have a bed in a group home across the city," Asha corrected quietly. "It's loud. It's angry. And it's not safe." She gestured to the stack of textbooks on the lab table, calculus, AP history, physics. "This place. St. Jude's, it's the only place where the noise stops. I stay late because if I go back there, I disappear. If I stay here, if I study until my eyes burn, I might actually get out." She looked at him then, her expression open and raw. "I came back for you because I know what it's like to be trapped in a place that wants to hurt you, waiting for someone, anyone, to open a door. Nobody ever opened it for me. I couldn't leave you chained to that pillar knowing nobody was coming for you either." Du-hyun studied her for a long moment, the silence between them shifting. The contempt he had shown earlier, the dismissal of her as just a naive child, evaporated. He looked at the heavy textbook she carried like armor, then down at his own bruised knuckles and the gunmetal gray of the shadows he lived in. He let out a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so devoid of humor. He reached out, his hand hovering near her arm before dropping back to the floor. "We are not so different," he murmured, his gaze drifting to the dark corners of the room. "You build walls out of paper and grades. I build mine out of fear and violence." He met her eyes, and the connection between them snapped into place, a terrifying, unbreakable understanding. "You hide in books. I hide in shadows. Tonight, we are the same." The moment of understanding shattered as quickly as it had formed. Du-hyun gripped the edge of the lab table, his face hardening back into the mask of the survivor. "We move," he grated out. "If they are sweeping the perimeter, the main lobby is our only chance before they tighten the noose." Asha stepped under his arm again, bracing for the crushing weight. They moved slower now, the adrenaline fading into a dull, aching exhaustion. The hallway leading to the main entrance was wide, lined with banners celebrating school spirit and academic excellence. At the far end, the double glass doors beckoned, framed by the soft, welcoming glow of the street lamps outside. Freedom. Asha's heart leaped. They were going to make it. She picked up the pace, dragging Du-hyun forward, but his hand suddenly clamped onto her shoulder like a vice, jerking her to a halt behind a decorative pillar. "Wait," he hissed. Asha peered around the concrete edge, and the hope in her chest died a violent death. The exit wasn't empty. Standing directly in front of the glass doors was a silhouette. It was one of the men from the locker room, his raincoat shedding water onto the polished terrazzo floor. But it was his position that made the scene feel like a violent hallucination. He was leaning casually against the massive glass trophy case that housed the football team's regional championship cups. The golden statuettes and silver plaques glittered under the lobby lights, symbols of teenage glory and innocent competition. And right next to them, resting against the glass, was the matte black barrel of a suppressed submachine gun. The image was wrong, a glitch in reality. The killer checked his watch, looking bored, as if he were waiting for a bus rather than waiting to execute two people. He was desecrating the sanctity of the space just by existing there, turning the school's proudest monument into a sniper's nest. The contrast between the gold trophies and the black gun made Asha feel sick. "He's watching the street," Du-hyun whispered, his mouth right against Asha's ear. "And the hall. We step out, we die." "We can't go back to the lab," Asha breathed, panic rising. "They'll check it soon." "The cafeteria," Du-hyun decided, nodding toward a set of swinging doors to their left. "Kitchens. Service exit." They retreated into the shadows, moving backward with agonizing slowness. Asha kept her eyes on the gunman by the trophy case, praying he wouldn't turn his head. They slipped through the cafeteria doors, leaving the lobby behind, plunging into a room that smelled of industrial sanitizer and yesterday's lunch, trading one trap for another. They slipped through the swinging doors into the faculty lounge, a room that smelled of stale coffee, photocopier toner, and the lingering anxiety of underpaid teachers. It was a mundane sanctuary, filled with world's best teacher mugs and stacks of ungraded essays, but to Du-hyun, it was a command center. He collapsed into a rolling office chair, his breath coming in jagged gasps, but his eyes were scanning the room with predatory focus. They landed on the beige landline phone sitting on the vice principal's desk. "My phone," Asha whispered, pulling her mobile from her pocket. "I can try again." "Useless," Du-hyun cut her off. "They have jammers. Signal blockers. Why do you think no alarm has sounded? We are in a dead zone." He gestured to the desk. "Analog line. Hardwire. It is the only way out." He grabbed the receiver. No dial tone. The line was locked down after hours, controlled by a central switchboard. Du-hyun didn't panic. He grabbed a metal letter opener from the desk. With a violent, precise motion, he jammed the blade into the plastic seam of the phone's base, twisting until the casing cracked open. He wasn't fumbling anymore. His hands, though shaking slightly from blood loss, moved with the practiced efficiency of a bomb tech. He stripped 2 copper wires with his teeth, spitting the plastic casing onto the carpet, and tapped them against the metal terminals. Click. Hum. A dial tone. He tapped the hook switch in a rhythmic pattern, old-school freaking, bypassing the keypad entirely to pulse dial a number from memory. Asha watched, mesmerized and terrified. The man bleeding out on the cheap polyester chair vanished. In his place sat the king of Los Angeles. His spine straightened, ignoring the shattered leg. The grimace of pain smoothed into a mask of absolute, terrifying coldness. He wasn't a victim surviving the night, he was a general organizing a war. The line clicked open. Do-hyun didn't say hello. He spoke 2 words in Korean, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with the dark, gravelly authority that made the hair on Asha's arms stand up. Black Lotus. A pause. The person on the other end was listening. Sector 7. Extraction immediate. Burn protocol. He listened for 1 second, then hung up. He didn't ask if they were coming. He commanded it, and he knew it would be done. He looked up at Asha. The vulnerability from the chemistry lab was gone, sealed away behind a wall of steel. They are coming, he said, and for the first time Asha realized that the men hunting them outside weren't the only monsters in the building. She had just unleashed the biggest one of all. The door to the library swung shut behind them, cutting off the drone of the hallway ventilation, but the silence that welcomed them wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, waiting. The vast room was a labyrinth of tall oak shelves, smelling of vanilla, dust, and decaying glue, the scent of 1,000 stories sleeping in the dark. Through the stacks, Do-hyun commanded, his voice tight with pain. Keep low. They made it 3 aisles deep before the beam of a tactical flashlight swept over the tops of the shelves like a lighthouse. It caught the movement of Asha's shadow against the spines of the history section. Yogita! There! The shout shattered the library's sacred quiet. Heavy boots thundered against the carpeted floor, closing the distance terrifyingly fast. Go! Do-hyun roared, abandoning stealth. He shoved Asha forward, hopping on his good leg, using the shelves to hold himself upright. They scrambled down the narrow aisle, the flashlight beam dancing wildly around them. The pursuer was faster, unburdened by injury. Asha could hear the rasp of his breath, the click of a weapon safety disengaging. They were going to be shot in the back amongst the encyclopedias. The shelf. Do-hyun barked. He didn't wait for her. He threw his entire body weight against the tall wooden unit filled with heavy reference books. He grunted, a primal sound of exertion, as the wood groaned in protest. With a deafening crash, the shelf tipped. It slammed into the next unit, creating a violent domino effect. The sound was apocalyptic, thousands of pounds of knowledge cascading down, blocking the aisle in a chaotic mountain of paper and wood. The gunman shouted as he was forced to dive back, but the barrier was only temporary. Asha stumbled toward the circulation desk, pulling Do-hyun, but a second figure lunged from the shadows of the fiction section. He had circled around. A gloved hand shot out, grabbing the handle of Asha's backpack. She was jerked backwards so hard her feet left the floor. She screamed, flailing, scratching at the leather glove, but the man was too strong. He spun her around, raising a combat knife that glinted wickedly in the dim light. Do-hyun didn't have a gun. He didn't have a knife. He was crippled and unarmed. But he was not helpless. As the man raised the blade, Do-hyun lunged from the floor where he had fallen. He didn't reach for the attacker's throat, he reached for the circulation desk. His hand closed around a ceramic mug filled with student supplies. He snatched a yellow number 2 pencil, sharpened to a needle point for final exams. With a speed that blurred the air, Do-hyun drove the graphite tip into the soft flesh of the attacker's thigh, missing the artery but hitting the nerve cluster. The man held, his grip on Asha loosening. Do-hyun didn't stop. He pulled the pencil out and stabbed again, this time driving the writing implement through the man's hand, pinning it to the wooden desk. The pencil snapped. The man collapsed, writhing. Asha stared, horrified. A tool she used every day to solve equations and write essays was now buried in human flesh, dripping blood onto the return books here sign. The mundane had been weaponized, perverted into something lethal in Do-hyun's hands. He looked at her, breathing hard, holding the broken half of the pencil like a shiv. "School is over," he panted. "Move." The library doors swung shut behind them, but the reprieve was a lie. They stumbled into the main atrium of St. Jude's, a soaring space of glass and polished stone that was meant to inspire awe but now felt like an aquarium. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the city lights outside into streaks of neon blood. They were 10 feet from the exit when the shadows detached themselves from the walls. One figure stepped out from behind the reception desk. Another emerged from the dark hallway leading to the auditorium. 2 more blocked the main doors, their silhouettes stark against the storm raging outside. The trap hadn't just closed, it had been welded shut. Asha skidded to a halt, the soles of her sneakers squeaking on the terrazzo. She instinctively pulled backward, but there was nowhere to go. They were encircled. 4 men, 4 guns, all leveled at the center of the room. The silence that fell was heavy and final, broken only by the ragged sound of Do-hyun's breathing and the thunder rattling the glass panes. Do-hyun didn't try to run. He didn't try to fight. He knew the math of violence better than anyone, and he knew the equation had just balanced out to 0. He released his grip on Asha's shoulder. "Get behind me," he said. His voice was no longer a command or a growl. It was quiet, calm, and terrifyingly resigned. He shoved her gently but firmly toward the marble pillar of the reception desk, positioning his broken body between her and the firing squad. He stood on one leg, swaying slightly, blood soaking his ruined trousers, but he held his head high. He adjusted his cuffs, a reflex of dignity in the face of execution, and looked at the lead assassin. The gunman said something in Korean, a sneer, a taunt about how the great king had fallen. Do-hyun didn't respond to him. He turned his back on the killers, facing Asha. She was pressed against the cold marble, her eyes wide, trembling so hard her teeth chattered. She looked at him, waiting for a plan, for a miracle, for the monster to bare his teeth and save them again. But the fire in Do-hyun's eyes had dimmed to embers. He looked at her uniform, at the terrified girl who had walked into hell just to save a stranger. "I am sorry," he whispered. It was the first time he had apologized. He saw the gunmen raising their weapons behind him. He saw the inevitable muzzle flash reflected in the glass. Do-hyun reached out. His hand, large and calloused and stained with the violence of the night, cupped the side of her face. It was surprisingly warm. He slid his palm over her eyes, plunging her world into darkness. He didn't want her to see the bullets hit him. He didn't want the last thing she ever saw to be his death. "Don't look," he murmured against her forehead, his body tensing as he prepared to absorb the impact. "Just listen to the rain, Asha. Just listen to the rain." The bullet never came. Instead, the world exploded. A deafening roar drowned out the thunder, followed instantly by the shrieking tear of metal and the catastrophic shattering of glass. The floor beneath Asha's feet lurched as a massive, matte black SUV smashed through the front entrance of St. Jude's Academy. The vehicle didn't slow down, it plowed through the aluminum frames and tempered glass like a battering ram, debris spraying across the marble lobby like deadly confetti. Do-hyun's hand ripped away from Asha's eyes. He didn't flinch at the destruction, he leaned into it. The resignation vanished, replaced instantly by the lethal precision of a predator who had just been handed a weapon. "Down," he roared, shoving Asha toward the floor as the SUV skidded to a halt, its armored tires smoking on the polished stone. The doors of the vehicle flew open before it had even stopped moving. 4 men in tactical gear poured out, their movements fluid and synchronized. They didn't shout. They didn't hesitate. They simply raised compact assault rifles and unleashed a torrent of suppressive fire at the stunned hitmen. The noise was indescribable. The enclosed atrium amplified every gunshot into a physical blow that rattled Asha's teeth. Bullets chewed into the plaster walls and shattered the trophy cases, sending gold cups spinning through the air. The hitmen, caught off guard by the sheer violence of the breach, scrambled for cover, but they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. "Get her inside," a voice shouted in Korean from the driver's seat. Do-hyun didn't wait. He grabbed the back of Asha's blazer, his grip like iron. Adrenaline must have flooded his system, overriding the agony of his broken leg, because he moved with terrifying speed. He didn't guide her, he manhandled her, dragging her through the sea of broken glass toward the open back door of the SUV. Asha stumbled, her ears ringing, her vision blurring from the shock. She saw a muzzle flash bloom in the dark, saw one of the enemy gunmen jerk backward as red mist sprayed the wall behind him. It was a war zone, and she was the cargo. "In!" Do-hyun yelled over the cacophony. He didn't help her climb in. He physically picked her up by the waist and threw her into the back seat. Asha tumbled onto the plush leather, scraping her knee against the doorframe, her backpack getting tangled in her legs. The interior smelled of new leather and conditioned air, a jarring, sterile luxury amidst the carnage. Do-hyun dove in after her, his broken leg dragging, just as a bullet sparked against the armored frame of the door. He slammed the heavy door shut, sealing them inside. The muffled thud cut off the screaming violence outside, replacing it with a hum of reinforced steel and the desperate, ragged sound of their own breathing. They were alive, but the sanctuary of the school was gone, replaced by the belly of the beast. The SUV lurched forward with a force that pinned Asha against the buttersoft leather, the tires screaming as the driver navigated the wreckage of the lobby and tore out into the stormy night. Rain lashed against the reinforced windows, blurring the world outside into streaks of neon and shadow. Asha twisted in her seat, pressing her hand against the cold glass. Through the tinted window, she watched St. Jude's Academy recede into the distance. The flashing blue lights of approaching police cars reflected off the wet pavement, but they were driving away from them. The library where she studied, the locker room where she hid, the hall she walked every day trying to be invisible, it was all shrinking, disappearing into the dark. She clutched her backpack to her chest, her fingers digging into the straps. Inside were her textbooks, her notes, her neatly organized life plan. It felt absurdly light now, like holding on to a ghost. "Don't look back." Do-hyun's voice was low, devoid of the pain that had racked him only minutes ago. He was leaning back against the seat, his broken leg extended, a medic already cutting away his pant leg to access the wound. He looked battered, blood-soaked, and exhausted, but the aura of command had returned. The cornered animal was gone, the king was back on his throne. Asha turned to face him. "My scholarship, the dean, if I explain." "There is nothing to explain," Do-hyun cut her off, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "They saw your face, Asha. The men who came for me tonight, they do not leave loose ends. If you go back there, if you go back to your group home, you will be dead before sunrise." The air in the car felt suddenly thin. Asha looked down at her uniform, stained with grease and the blood of a Mafia boss. She thought she would feel terror at his words. She thought she would scream, cry, fight to get out. Instead, a strange, cold calm settled over her. For 18 years, she had been alone, fighting a system that didn't care if she lived or died. She had been prey waiting for the world to eat her. Now, sitting next to a man who had killed to keep her breathing, she realized the terrifying truth. She felt safer in this armored cage with a monster than she had ever felt in the open world. Do-hyun reached out, resting his heavy hand over hers on the backpack. It wasn't a gentle gesture, it was a claim. A possession. "You saved the devil, Asha," he murmured, his gaze intense enough to burn. "Now you have to live in his hell. Under my roof. Under my protection." He looked past her, out at the city skyline rising up to meet them. "School is out, Asha. Welcome to the real world." Asha's old life is over, but her life as the Mafia boss's protected witness has just begun. If you want to see how she survives in a world of luxury, violence, and forbidden romance, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The real lesson starts now.